So, welcome to lecture Heidegger 1007. We will today talk about something that is called scale relativity. And it's an article by Laurent, Nottale and Charles Offrey. But I've written the name Kerri Welch instead. Then you can zoom in on that. And it's an understanding of proper scale, a situational scale, versus a generalized a priori scale, something I call a mold scale. It's a scale that is before the fact or the presencing or whatever you can call it. Is that you say that there's a ready-made scale instead of investigating. And it's in the subject literature, history of ideas, that is more or less like idé- och lärdomshistoria, and genius science, science of genius. The background is that systems approach in biology is almost as old as physiology. And this is something Nottale wrote about already in 1993, and that's a way of looking at scale as the most important thing in literature and an understanding of texts, because a scale that is a mold scale, it is like you say things are relative to each other before you're looking into how they are, and this is almost always the case. Well, I would say it's always the case. We never look into the text to compare what the text actually have. Also want to do see a proper scale or scaling. Scale is very important, and in some sense this reminds us about what we talked about in physics, where mold scale, a scale before the fact, makes prediction very hard. But here's going into the detail in literature, where scale fixation or mold scale makes reading impossible, I would say, almost impossible anyway. It's very important to know in a specific context, for instance, as we are standing here, Kalle is shorter, is slightly taller than I am, but also the difference in distance in between us affects the scale and what sort of comparison we can make here. So you see, scale is always what you could call situational. And ignoring that, then you don't have scale at all, according to Laurent Nottale. Because it's a little bit, if you have a recipe to make a soup, you can't mix it with a recipe to make cinnamon buns. They need to be made in each turn. And this is largely ignored in the discourse of today. We mix and we don't care what recipe it is, as long as it's make up some food or some other detail. And scale, according to Laurent Nottale, is rather different than that. This, of course, when we talk about scale, we also talk about time. Well, why is that? Well, the reason is, I was mentioning a movement. I had an example here speaking about the scale in the difference in length between me and Kalle Lundahl here. And that is depending on what time also. If we move slightly, the difference is going to be different. So time is of immense importance, and time is always ignored in modern discourse and context. It's never a fact. And when I realize this, I also think to myself, that will actually implicate that it never hits the target. It will always be wrong. So it's very important to know the timing to the utmost perfection. Because at different timing, imagine Kalle moving away from me. All of a sudden, the difference between me and Kalle would be completely different. And in the example of Nottale, it's the text trying to read literature and ignoring that. For instance, the writer maybe wants to compare a summer's day to a winter's day, and not understanding that this has to be done in that instant. Maybe it is summer, maybe it is a July night. And if you don't care about that, you will not make a proper scale comparison. And as literary criticism is today, that is not part of the equation. We just generalize. We have a generalized conception of what the meaning should be a priori. So we don't care about the details that were intended by the author. And this is something that could be called pointing with the whole arm. So if somebody's asking me, where is the iPad? It's here, I could point, specifically point it out like this. But this educational thing is pointing with the whole hand, like this, or like this. So you see, it doesn't hit the target. It is not specific for the moment. And this is usually defended. We want to make didactics or pedagogy generalized, so it fits all situations. But I think what Nottale is hinting to, fitting all the situations means fitting none of the situations. And that is part of the problem. We need to be specific and not generalized, so we lack the knowledge. See if I can find some more in this. Yes. This is called Nottale's fractal space-time, and it's that a one-dimensional macroscopic space-time path takes on a 2D fractal dimension microscopically, and there are infinitely many fractal geodesic paths between any 2 points in space-time. A particle chooses only one of the paths, and here we have the Mandelbrot set. So it's entering into literary criticism and the history of ideas as well, which made me really happy. And I have to point out the first book by Nottale is in 1993, but the development nowadays, it's coming when it comes into literature, is much later. This is something I studied science of literature very briefly for half a year, but I noticed it was a certain pointing with the whole hand. And when we try to say, did the author really mean it here? It seems that you are being generalizing too much. The lecturer always said that to generalize is important, because otherwise I have nothing to teach, more or less. It needs to be the same. Well, then it doesn't matter which book it is. Well, that's the whole point, he said, with science of literature. The book shouldn't matter. The rules you make up should be so generalized that they could apply to every book. And I think that sort of thinking goes in sharp contrast to the idea of Laurent Nottale. He meant what the author meant in a certain instant is very important. I have a specific memory. It was from the history of ideas, and we took up a text from Duns Scotus. I don't know if you know about him. Do you?
Oh, the name is familiar. The medieval scholastic.
Yes, Duns Scotus.
Heidegger began with him in his young years.
Oh, do you know? Duns actually stands for stupid, and that was his epithet he gave to himself, that he felt himself stupid. It's an act of humbleness. And we discussed him. We were several people said, in this special instance, Duns is contradicting himself, or something similar. And I remember how the professor said, well, don't go too sharp into the details. Have a generalized idea of what Duns is meaning. And then we protested rather wildly and said, well, is not what is being written his meaning? And then the professor said there could be some discussion on that. So I think the modern take on what does Scotus...
They're very tasty. I can recommend we can make publicity for this.
We need to take them away.
Now, Pornia protest widely.
I have to serve them afterwards. I think it shows two different pictures of how we see understanding of a text. What the professor meant was his take on the text of Duns Scotus, or the institutional understanding of Duns Scotus, and by bringing up things that Duns actually wrote. For the example, let's assume that he actually wrote that. That could be without question. It's not important for the example. Then the professor said that was not important. It was the general take. And another way of explaining it is that the professor's take was simpler, more generalized, not going into the details. And he might have been thinking, if you go into the details, you will lose that generalized perception of Duns Scotus. So that could also, and this is very important here, this is actually the point of Nottale in its first book from 1993. There is generally a problem between big versus small, and many versus few or one. And then I'll have to say that specific, we put general here, versus specific. So it could be a sort of battle in between here, and what the professor meant was that we cannot have any conception of Duns Scotus if we don't make him general. And maybe we were in that specific interest in protesting and saying, here we see this in his text, this is what he's actually writing. And the professor was saying, let's ignore that, otherwise we would lose the general perspective on Duns Scotus, and then we can't make a summary of him or have an understanding in a short term or a short lecture. It was just one lecture about Duns Scotus. And to a degree I can understand that, because it makes sense. If you go into specific details too much, you lose the general. If you take too few examples like this little text that we took, you forget the many of Duns Scotus. And if you go into the smallness, you forget the bigness. And that could be reversed. Isn't that an interesting problem? And very hard to solve. I could see the point of the professor, but I could also see our own point. Nottale has a solution to this problem, and he had it already in 1993. How do we solve it? Well, it's to do with this scale relativity. And that means that we can both go into specific details into a text. We can have sort of a careful reading of the text, really understand the text, and that does not mean we lose out on the general meaning. What he says, it is just the opposite. Isn't that interesting? I would say I have to admit that I saw both arguments as valid. Of course, in the class I was widely defending our view. There were a few of us. But later I also saw the view of the professor as being of great validity. And I did not really have a solution to the problem. So I persisted to defend my own view, but actually I didn't have much material to go on. I thought this to be very important. And of course, since I took up deconstruction and such things, that makes sense. But I was lacking in argument. That I have to be honest with. I had to make up with examples, which is good also. Nottale says that doesn't have to be the case. And it isn't the case. And it wasn't the case. There is a solution, and the solution is this scale relativity. That scale actually gets better by taking in both specific and general. And general doesn't have to be a priori goal. That is the fault of the professor. This is the part of his argument that I should attack, not all of it. I think his quest for generality, that was just, but it's a certain detail in his argument, and that is, in order to have generality, we have to take away all the details. Sort of, if we're going to make a general person at this building, let's assume there is 100 people here. Some people look like this, some have very small noses and have small eyes, some are big eyes. And then we're going to make a general person. We will get a person with the average length on the nose and the average size of the eyes and the average height. According to Nottale, that is not how it works. And interestingly enough, this also has a connection to Duns Scotus. Why is that? Why on earth? You have to guess, Kalle.
Does it relate to apes?
No, it didn't. Sorry, Kalle. It has to do with the nominalists. Versus the universalists. This battle, that battle is no longer necessary, but it was a battle that was going in the ages. For instance, Augustine was a very convinced universalist, and then we have the nominalists. I understand the battle is unsolvable until you understand what Nottale means. And he means that by having more specificity, you will also gain generality. Isn't that amazing? By having a lot of the few examples in the text, sentences even, could be words, you will also have the many, the whole lot, all of the text of Duns Scotus, or whomever it might be. And that would apply to the small versus the big. This is usually the case. Or I can take in too many small details, then I would lose the big picture. These are problems people have been fighting over for ages. And I always had a perception I'm not happy with either solution, although I usually choose the side of the nominalists. Now that could be actually solved. So we can eat the cookie and we can keep the cookie. And as I mentioned 2 lectures ago, it seems to be the self-organization systems in all living creatures as well as all non-living creatures or systems, that this is a necessity for this, and vice versa. This is needed to have specificity, many is needed to have few or one, big, hugeness, to go down to small. This is scale relativity. And that solves a big problem within literary criticism, because to have a generalized text, for me, that really felt like taking all the sense of the text out and not caring about what the author actually wrote. Although I understood the suggestion from the professor, don't read the text, I couldn't agree emotionally. It felt bad to take away. He's a good writer as well, Duns Scotus. I felt ashamed to take away his details, his complexities, because for me therein lied the interesting things. And a generalized text was almost like reading the summary in a book about literary criticism. I mentioned a few other subjects here. Biology is one of those, but also science of genus science. Because in genus science it seems to be the same thing. We cannot go into individual men or women. We can only generalize, having the many. But if we go into a few, have an example of one person and that person's life or common day, or that person's experiences, I felt this way, this day. That is a big no-no within the science of genus.
Gender studies.
Gender studies, cheers. Because that will take away, as it's assumed, and it probably is, the force of the argument. How can you make a valid argument and say this about women and that about man? This about class and this about heritage or DNA structure, which is very important today. For instance, this book, I just briefly looked into it. This
Segal.
is by Nancy L. Segal. It's called Deliberately Divided. It is more or less a brand new book. It was published in 2021, and she makes a very valid argument that the previously perceived idea that all or a lot of properties a human being has are shared by the twin. And that meaning that heritage or DNA makeup decides everything. That really big investigation was made in the 30s already, as long before we even know about DNA. That came with Francis Crick, Francis Crick, 1953, who discovered the DNA. But this was like 20 years before that event, and at least 30 years before it got really big, so to speak. So of course the first revolution in thinking about twins and our inheritance was amplified by the DNA structure. And when the DNA structure, because it was already established that heritage was so important, much more important than upbringing, your parents, who they were, in which society you were brought up, which schooling you had, what economical status you had, and so forth. None of those details mattered anything in the big investigations in the 1930s. And then we have the DNA. And because this first thing was already in place, of course, we use DNA to explain. And that's very important to understand. That amplified the whole thing. If the first investigation would not have been in place, there would have been nothing to amplify. And the whole thinking solution could have been more open. So then you can understand how that developed. It developed into people thinking that heritage, our DNA, decided 80–90%. And that's also, I would say, 100% the reason for the fame, the wealth, and the influence of another person. It's very influential today. It's a bit taller than I am. It's older than I am. And he wrote a book in the late 70s that today is one of the most influential books when thinking about philosophy, ethics, sociology, and so forth.
Peter Jordansen? No.
Come again?
Jordansen.
This guy is actually older than Jordan Peterson, and I think it's one of our more popular people to speak about. More behind his back than in front of his face. He's grey-haired, he's British, he's probably upper class, well educated. I don't think John Cleese is, well, he's half upper class. It's Dawkins.
Yes, the Satan himself.
Yes. Dawkins has all his fame coming from this, because if inheritance would not have been important, his theory of the selfish gene that made his fortune and his fame, that wouldn't have any leverage, because it is dependent on inheritance being 80–90% of what we are and how we act and how we build our society. And of course that means that his book also gains popularity. This book goes to the contrary to that completely. It breaks everything that we established about inheritance. It's a book that is maybe the most extreme book to come out within genetics the last couple of decades, I would say. The only thing that can compete with this is the understanding that we are not coming from one descent. But this is just extreme. You have no idea how much this idea of inheritance has influenced subjects like, well, even science of literature. Yes.
Well, Dawkins could say that, okay, perhaps I'm not completely right, but the right environment could help you to become more selfish. The right circumstance helps you to become more selfish, or wrong environment.
Well, my point here is it doesn't affect whether Dawkins is right or wrong. So his book will go to be untouched, because what he is establishing is the connection between gene and development within biology, and that is the gene is progressing the development. But his fame, his area becomes much smaller. So his dominion, his realm, his kingdom is becoming smaller. So I'm not questioning his kingdom, his authority is not questioned by this. But what is questioned is what he can say about the world. And that's another business.
And you remember Segal what he pointed out regarding Darwin, that Darwin took things out of isolation.
Yes.
And there's the same problem then.
It's the same problem, but I think the problem is pre-established, because I don't think this is a very big part of the problem, because in the discussions I had when I studied these subjects, I didn't have any good arguments, to be honest. I was going on my gut feeling, and I should not compare myself to Ian McGilchrist, but there's some similarity. I recognize myself in his experience of being frustrated in studying how poems got dissected and put into little pieces. He didn't have an argument either. Now, of course, he has more than an argument. I cannot say that I have that, but at least I have some argument now, and I could defend my position. But before that, I felt like being naughty or something by claiming the specific over the general. I was being, as you say in Swedish, I don't know if there is an equivalence in English, but motvals. Yeah, it's a specific Swedish one. But now, this is just amazing. And I think there is a connection to what Nancy L. Segal is pointing out. And it's that we've been focusing too much on the small. And we said that there is a connection between the small and the general. And those things had to go somehow. She's defending the big picture. The big picture is, where is your upbringing? Who are your parents? How are your parents? What is their economy? And what is the level of education, religion, tradition? This is very interesting. It's the small and the big when it comes to knowledge is coming back. And of course, from one take, it's a very important research book. Wow, it's just blown my mind. I had no idea. It's just amazing. But the second thing, it's also brought this to life, this problem here. And the battle between the nominalist and universalist, for me it's been hard to have a point there. I can only take the most extreme cases, and those are easy to argue against. But if you have a more decent nominalist take and a more decent universalist take, it's very hard to have an argument. You feel like hitting on something that is actually valid. It is valid, but the other point is also valid. So this is scale relativity, and it's a fantastic solution. And it comes from science itself. So this is spreading out. Just odd that Nottale is so early on. This is already in 1993. So it's some people have really sort of put their antennas out there and felt where the wave is going, and preemptively put up a theory, and the theory that later get renovated, improved, and got to this measure now. I think is widely interesting. And this ignorance of important feature in reality, like timing, where is something happening? Scale relativity takes timing into the picture once more. It is not unimportant when things occur. It's very important. And that goes for the text as well. It is very, very important when in the text something happens. You cannot take a certain paragraph, a certain verse, a certain few lines out of their context. And this is also something that is often done with generalities. You take it out of its context and you sort of highlight it. And this actually shows that reading is a complete adventure. It's a science in itself, and that science will be different for every book you read. And you can't use the same principle to 100%. You need to change your principle, you need to be flexible, you need to be sort of open-minded. And if this puts a really specific blow, it's to that biased reading, the constricted reading, that says this is what the book says, which I really dislike. And it's a very common today that a certain book means this. And often that gets some connection to what I would call conformist thinking, and that is maybe the biggest blow point, because if you fall into one of these categories and you defend, usually this one, what will happen, and this is most interesting, what will happen to your meaning? Very important part from point from Nottale. What? I'll actually put zoom in on that. That's the most important part. What will happen to your meaning if you ignore, as that is mostly the case, scale relativity? What will happen is your meaning will have to conform to conformity, the general conception of what books, what the modern time is, because you become weak. If you take out the force of the text, if you don't take the details and you don't take the generalities and you do this other thing as my professor suggested, not by bad intent, but because he and me, we didn't know any better. None of us did. But it would still mean that he had to conform to a conformist meaning of the book. And that is what the general public is thinking of a certain book or book in general. Because your opinion weakens, literally weakens. And it doesn't matter if you have support or not, it's still a weakening. You can be 1 million people, it's still a weak opinion. And that, of course, defies all we think about opinion. We think if an opinion is supported by millions, it has to be a strong opinion. I always had my qualms when it comes to these great leaders, like Hitler and Stalin. But oddly enough, our regular thinking actually supported them, because our take on what is good meaning is supported by the many, the conformal way of seeing. And I always thought that can't be right. If the whole world supported Hitler, I still think it would be wrong. It's an odd opinion. I was hugely criticized, of course, for this opinion when I was younger. But I always felt that it can't be that way. But until recently, I had no argument whatsoever other than my gut feeling. So I had to keep my mouth shut when it came to those discussions. But what Nottale, and this is of course not Nottale only, but what Nottale and others are saying, no, it's not like that. An opinion can be self-supportive. Could be only one person, because it's the complexity. It is your ability to take in the small details in the book and the big details. And if you take only one side, your opinion will be weakened. But how the case used to be for many years is that we had usually generalities, could be specificity, but if it was generalities, doesn't matter. We choose one of the sides, not because malintent, not because ideology, not because that was the structure of the day, because the logic didn't have that option. There was no possibility of taking in both. That meant it became a weakened opinion, and that meant that books, and I would say especially since late 50s, early 60s, became more and more generalized in their reading. And that meant both the new books and all the old books. And since I have my favorite theory, why did the great masterpieces disappear from reading lists, and why don't we go into Shakespeare, Chaucer, the great Greeks anymore? I would say this is this tendency. And in a generalized reading, what sort of literature could actually take our interest? Well, it could not be Shakespeare, it could not be Chaucer. It had to be those fellows that turns up in the late 50s, like Jacques Kerouac and others, who are so radically contrary to the general trend. They appear to be, because they put in contradictions everywhere, sort of. And then they caught the interest, but they only last for a couple of decades. Who reads Jacques Kerouac these days? I would say no one. And that helps me to have my pet theory going on here. Why did the old masterpieces disappear? Why is knowledge going on? It had, according to Nottale and Kerri Welch, this is natural reasons. We didn't have a choice until now. I think this could become a revolution. It will be a revolution within genetics. This book is going to turn everything around. Everything. Trust me about that, because especially in our country, Sweden, the ideas of heritage is incredibly important, because they are actually the measuring rod. The measuring rod that all the other subjects are measured according to. This is what told my friend Nisse, who became a professor in sociology, the standard of his writing, and made him acclaimed. He had to acquire to that, which is a shame, because that means the measuring rod sort of limits the scope on what you can write and think. It's like having a sort of, you need to do one, you need to do two, you need to prove this almost. So there is a list already established before you start writing. And I remember his frustration, but he couldn't point at it. Where did it come from? I understand it. It's this measuring rod, because even if you like it, it limits you. It tells you already when you're starting to make your sketch. Well, even before, even if you go on vacation. He went to Australia, I remember that. He went to 2 months to Australia with his handledare, whatever that's in English. Supervisor, Thomas. They went to Australia, and that was his thinking period. But he felt limited. And this is a limited outtake coming from this measuring rod, and the measuring rod is this incredibly well established, almost 100 years. She is having very clear research. Look at the reference. It is massive. she is not going out empty-handed into these discussions. She has done her studies, her work. It is incredible. Look at the reference. It's massive. And I felt when you take up books that are 10, 20, 30, 40 years old and they write in the subjects, they are so self-confident they don't even have to put in a lot of reference. It's almost like they're saying everybody knows this. So understand the revolution. And this is not the subject that is close to my heart. We mentioned biology, and we were talking, I think it was like 3 years ago, about what's his name now? The American that showed that a common ancestor is not possible for.
The multimillionaire.
Yes.
What was it in 2012? The discovery.
So since that, it has not been much, and this is not. But it's. Then you understand why. Still, it's not a big subject. It's not close to my heart, but I still got completely blown. Wow! This is just amazing. It's. And this is going to shake some foundations. I recommend you to read it or check it out on the internet. There is available some articles by her on PDF in the academic sites. Some of those could actually be downloaded for free if you don't feel like, but it is amazing. It's even I, who don't think this subject is important for me, do understand that it's well, it's just sheer amazing. Yeah.
Can I write a thing?
Yeah, please.
I think I would like to thank you because you resolved a problem for me. So the last 2 hours yesterday, I was thinking about a problem that I read in Derrida. So he is quoting Heidegger, and Heidegger writes like this: apes, for instance, do not have hands.
Oh yes.
Okay,
yes.
so this was what Heidegger wrote,
Yes.
and then Derrida, he attacked this phrase, for instance,
Okay.
because Derrida said that yes, Heidegger has not studied zoologists or not the apes of Black Forest. Then Derrida got laughter from the audience.
Oh yeah, of course.
This was a transcription.
I wondered about that.
Okay, so the last 2 hours of yesterday evening, I was ruminating about this. This was the last thing I thought about before sleeping.
Yeah.
How can
Did you? Wow.
Yes, I even sent you an email
Yeah.
then in the evening yesterday, and but today you resolved this problem thanks to Nottale. So how did you resolve the problem? For instance, this is the universality. And Heidegger was speaking about universality. He was not thinking about one possible exception, one ape somewhere in the Black Forest could have hands. That's always possible, but he was really giving a university, and we have to differentiate from nominalists.
Yeah.
There could be one ape somewhere who has hands. So you resolve the problem, or Laurent Nottale resolved the problem. So this very thinking, Derrida actually mixes up two things. Here I don't like when he pokes fun at Heidegger, and he didn't have a real good answer. So in this case, this is very good. It's a genial thing. Universal, for instance, that's true. Apes do not have hands; they have jaws. So they are missing. Derrida is mixing two categories: the universality and nominality. So it's really good. This fractality resolves this problem.
Yeah.
So don't miss. You have pointed many times out the importance of time, like in this in Eva de Bono, that common people mix a priori, etc., etc.
Yes.
But it's also
very good.
Also very important, as you put out, thanks to Laurent Nottale, do not mix nominals with universals.
No.
So it's very good. Thank you, even a great philosopher, Kerri, for instance, makes here a mistake, I would say.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
I think it's unavoidable because this is new information. What Laurent Nottale was very early on catching on, and he rewrote what he wrote later on, of course, but he was very early on. And Susie Frobel. Her thing is even greater, even bigger, already in 2011, I think, and that's way before the time. Now the time is in for this sort of thinking. So it's very and it's also very important to point out once more. Sorry to be repetitive, but it was not militant by the professor. I didn't have a counter argument either. It couldn't be any argument. No one on earth, except maybe Laurent Nottale or Laurent Nottale, did have an argument at that time, and I didn't know him. I hadn't read his books. That would have been impossible.
And let me see. So Nottale wrote this thing in '93, and Derrida published his speech in 1987. Interesting.
Well, I think I conclude there. So a couple of recommendations here. Laurent Nottale, its book is ages, but you can find articles. Kerri Welch, I would actually recommend Kerri Welch before Nottale because she writes Nottale in a more common language. So Kerri Welch, it's a better choice here. And then, of course, if you can read maybe an article of Nancy L. Segal or the whole book, it would be great. Okay, thank you very much and have a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye.
Thank you.